the hunger strike that shook Pelican Bay for 21 days. The hunger strike started on July 1, 2011. Not with violence, not with riots, with silence. Stay with this story. What 6,600 inmates did simultaneously across California's prison system almost forced the state to rewrite its constitution. Pelican Bay State Prison, Crescent City, California, the northernmost tip of the state, surrounded by redwood forests and cold Pacific fog, built specifically to hold the people California couldn't hold anywhere else. Security Housing Unit, SHU, 80 square feet of concrete. No windows, no programs, no human contact beyond meal delivery and one attorney call per month. Some inmates had been there for decades. Officer James Whitfield had worked the SHU for 9 years. He'd seen hunger strikes before, individual protests, small groups. But on the morning of July 1st, when he did first rounds, something was different. Every tray returned untouched. All of them. "We have a situation," he radioed control. "Full SHU refusal. Entire unit." "How many?" Whitfield checked his count. 43. Control went quiet. Then, "Copy. Stand by." By noon, Whitfield got the bigger number. It wasn't just Pelican Bay. Across California's prison system, 6,600 inmates had simultaneously refused food. The largest hunger strike in California corrections history. And it had started here, in the SHU, because of something nobody in administration had taken seriously. A list. 5 weeks earlier, a handwritten document had been submitted to Pelican Bay's warden, titled, "Agreement to End Hostilities," signed by representatives of the Norteños, Serenos, Black Guerrilla Family, Aryan Brotherhood, and the Nazi Low Riders. 5 prison gangs, historically violent enemies, who had agreed to stop fighting, not just at Pelican Bay, across the entire California prison system. The document was unprecedented. Prison administrators had never seen rival gang representatives agree on anything. Warden Patricia Torres reviewed the document in her office. Her senior staff stood around the table. Most looked skeptical. "They want better food quality," one lieutenant said flatly. "Clean group exercise. Educational programming. An end to solitary confinement as punishment." "These are gang leaders negotiating prison policy," another officer said. "We don't negotiate with gang leaders." Torres looked at the document. "This isn't negotiation. They submitted this to the warden. To me. They're using official channels. They're manipulating the system. Or they've found common ground. 5 gangs that have been killing each other for 30 years don't find common ground." Torres folded the document. "File it. We'll review it through normal channels." Normal channels meant months of bureaucratic delay. Normal channels meant nothing would change. The 5 gang representatives had anticipated this, which is why they'd scheduled July 1st. Whitfield didn't know about the document when the strike started. None of the line officers did. They just knew the trays were coming back full and the SHU was quieter than it had ever been. That first afternoon, Whitfield walked the tier. 43 doors. 43 men behind concrete walls. No sound. "Talk to me, Santiago," Whitfield said at one door. He'd known the inmate for 7 years. 30 years in the SHU. Former gang leader. Spent his days reading law books. Santiago's voice came through the food slot. "You know why we're doing this? The document. You read it?" "No," Whitfield admitted. "Tell me." The pause. Then, "How long have you worked here?" 9 years. "In 9 years, have you seen anyone leave the SHU better than they came in?" Whitfield didn't answer. "I've been in this unit for 30 years, Santiago said. "I came in at 22. I'm 52 now. I've watched men lose their minds in these cells. I've watched men die in these cells. And I've watched the system keep sending more." "So you're refusing food." "We're refusing participation in a system that produces nothing. No rehabilitation. No reform. Just isolation that makes men more dangerous, not less." Whitfield stood in the corridor for a moment. "What do you actually want?" "Read the document." Whitfield went to the administrative office at end of shift. He asked about the document. The officer on duty showed him the filing system. The agreement to end hostilities was in a pending review folder, stamped with a date 6 weeks earlier, and a handwritten note from the warden. Monitor. No action required at this time. Whitfield read it in 5 minutes. Demands for better food quality, group exercise, educational programming, ending indefinite solitary confinement. These weren't unreasonable. He thought about Santiago. 30 years in 80 square feet. He thought about the trays coming back full. He thought about 6,600 inmates simultaneously refusing food. And he wondered whether the administration understood what they'd ignored. By day 3, the California Department of Corrections was in crisis management mode. Medical teams were stationed in every SHU facility. Attorneys were filing emergency injunctions. National media was arriving in Crescent City. The ACLU sent a team. Amnesty International issued a statement. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture requested information. Warden Torres held a press conference. This is an organized protest orchestrated by prison gang leaders. We take all inmate concerns seriously through proper channels. A reporter asked, did the prison receive a formal document from inmates prior to the strike? Torres paused. We receive many inmate communications. This one was signed by representatives of 5 separate gangs. It outlined specific demands. Was it addressed? It's under review. For how long? Torres didn't answer. Officer Whitfield watched the press conference from the staff room, then went back to his rounds. Day 4. Day 5. The trays kept coming back full. Santiago was losing weight visibly now. You're going to hurt yourself, Whitfield said. I've already hurt myself by being here, Santiago replied. The question is whether anyone's going to notice. On day 7, Whitfield made a decision that would cost him his career. He called a journalist. Not to give information, just to make sure someone outside the prison understood what the agreement to end hostilities actually said. How reasonable it was. How long it had sat unanswered. The journalist published the document in full. By the next morning, every major newspaper in California had it on the front page. And then investigators started looking at something nobody had examined before. How many inmates were currently in the SHU? What were their names? How long had they been there? When they checked the official classification records, everything changed. Because 83 of the inmates currently in the SHU had been there for over 15 years. Based on a single criterion, suspected gang affiliation. Not behavior. Not convictions. Suspicion. And some of the evidence used to place them there was decades old. Including one case where the supporting documentation didn't exist anymore. The classification system had a name. They called it the gang validation process. And it had been placing inmates in the SHU for decades based on criteria that were never publicly explained. Researcher Dr. Carol Strickland arrived at Pelican Bay on July 8. She worked for the Prison Law Office, a non-profit legal organization based in San Francisco. Her job was to review inmate records and identify legal violations. She'd worked in California prisons for 12 years, but she'd never seen anything like the SHU classification files. These are validation criteria? She asked the administrative officer handling her records request. Standard process, he said. Been in place since 1990. Strickland read through the criteria carefully. An inmate could be validated as a gang member and placed in indefinite SHU confinement based on 3 pieces of evidence. Any 3. From a list that included possession of gang-related artwork, association with known gang members, correspondence with validated gang members, possession of gang-related literature, and self-admission. But also this, being identified by another inmate as a gang member. An anonymous informant could validate someone for SHU placement, with no ability for the accused inmate to challenge the identification. No hearing. No defense. Just placement. How long can someone be held on this basis? Strickland asked. Indefinitely. Until they debrief. Debrief meaning? Provide information about gang activities. Name names. Then they go back to general population. Strickland processed this. So the only way out of indefinite solitary is to become an informant. Or demonstrate 6 years of clear conduct. 6 years in isolation to prove you've changed? That's the policy. Strickland pulled individual files. She started with the longest tenured SHU inmates. The stories were almost identical. Validated in the 1990s. Placed in SHU. Time accumulated. One inmate named Robert Draper had been in the SHU since 1993. 18 years. His original validation evidence, a drawing found in his cell, a letter from a cousin who was a known gang member, and identification by an anonymous informant. 3 pieces. Minimum threshold met. His conduct in the SHU for 18 years. Perfect. Not a single disciplinary report. Has he ever been reviewed for release from SHU? Strickland asked. The officer checked. Multiple requests. All denied. On what basis? Continued suspected gang affiliation. What evidence supports that after 18 years of perfect conduct? He's declined to debrief. He won't name people? Correct. So the evidence that he's still a gang member is that he won't become an informant? The officer looked uncomfortable. That's one way to characterize it. Strickland requested Draper's complete file. She read it twice. Then found the original validation documents. The drawing, a geometric pattern that could be interpreted as gang-related. The letter from his cousin discussed family matters. The gang reference was a mention of his cousin's associates. 3 words. The anonymous informant, completely redacted. No date. No context. No way to verify. This was the foundation for 18 years of isolation. Strickland pulled 30 more files. Same pattern. Thin evidence. Anonymous informants. Perfect conduct. Repeated denial. She went to interview Draper. The meeting room was a concrete box with a steel table. Draper was brought in wearing full restraints. He was 51 years old. He'd entered the SHU at 33. Mr. Draper, I'm reviewing your classification records. I want to understand your case. Draper looked at her with the particular stillness of a man who'd spent decades controlling every reaction. There's not much to understand, he said. The system put me here. The system keeps me here. The system doesn't make mistakes. Do you know why you've never been released from SHU? I won't tell them what they want to hear. I won't name people. People who might hurt you if you did? People who might get hurt. I grew up with these men. They have families. Even if I had information worth giving, I wouldn't trade their safety for mine. Strickland looked at his hands. Perfectly still on the steel table. What does a normal day look like for you? I wake up. I exercise in the cell. I read. I write legal briefs. I eat. I sleep. Repeat. Do you speak to anyone? Officers who do their jobs properly. A few neighbors through the walls. Not often. What do you think about? For the first time, something shifted in his expression. I think about what I would have been. If this hadn't happened. I was going to be an engineer. I had a scholarship. Then one decision at 21 ended everything. Do you regret it? Every day. But that's not why I should get out of here. I should get out because prolonged isolation is cruel. Because it doesn't make anyone safer. Because the research is clear that it causes irreversible psychological damage. He tapped the table. I've read everything published on solitary confinement. I understand it better than most of the people administering it. Why the hunger strike? Because we tried everything else. Letters. Legal petitions. Formal requests. 18 years of model conduct. Nothing moved the needle. So we stopped eating. Isn't that dangerous? So is spending 18 years in a box. Strickland returned to her office and began compiling her report. The findings were significant. The SHU population, approximately 4,000 inmates at peak. Average stay, 6.5 years. Longest stay documented, over 20 years. Basis for most placements, gang validation. Appeal success rate, less than 2%. Debriefing rate, extremely low. She cross-referenced the data with recidivism research, Inmates released directly from SHU to the streets, no transitional housing, no programming, had significantly higher reoffending rates. The isolation that was supposed to make California safer was producing more dangerous outcomes upon release. She included this in her report, then discovered something she hadn't expected. The California Department of Corrections had its own internal research showing the same findings. Dated 2003. 8 years earlier, the department had known the SHU wasn't working and hadn't changed anything. The hunger strike entered its second week. Inmates were beginning to show physical effects. Medical teams recorded weight loss across all facilities. Several inmates required hospitalization. The California Department of Corrections was dealing with simultaneous crises at multiple facilities. And the media pressure was intensifying. The agreement to end hostilities was now being discussed in the state legislature. Assemblymember Tom Amiano introduced emergency legislation requiring review of all long-term SHU placements. The prison system's response was immediate. They contacted the warden of every facility with SHU population. The message was clear: do not negotiate. Do not concede. Let the strike run its course. Warden Torres complied. But something was happening inside the SHU that nobody in Sacramento was monitoring. The long-term isolation cases. The 83 inmates who'd been there over 15 years. Their physical condition was deteriorating faster. Because they were older. Because their systems were weaker. Because 18 years of institutional food had compromised their health before the strike even started. Draper was now on day 11. The prison doctor visited him daily. "Your sodium levels are dropping," the doctor said. "I know. If they drop further, you'll need hospitalization." "I know. Why are you doing this? You're 51. Your body can't handle this the way a 20-year-old can." Draper looked at him. "Because I've tried every other way. And because if I die in a hunger strike, that's a story. If I die quietly in this cell after 20 years, that's Tuesday." The doctor filed his report. Flagged Draper as high medical risk. The report went to the chief medical officer. The chief medical officer forwarded it to Sacramento. Sacramento forwarded it to legal. Legal reviewed it for liability. Their recommendation: document thoroughly and monitor. Not address the underlying cause. Not negotiate with the inmates. Document and monitor. Officer Whitfield was still working his rounds. He'd been interviewed by the journalist once. The story had run. Now 3 national outlets were calling. He wasn't returning their calls. But he was watching. On day 12, he stopped at Santiago's door. "How are you holding up?" Santiago's voice was weaker. "Still here." "Are they going to give you what you asked for?" Long pause. "No. They never were going to." "Then why keep going?" "Because the people who come after us deserve better than this." Whitfield stood at the door. "The document you submitted. The agreement to end hostilities. Do you know what I found when I looked at how it was processed? It was filed and ignored. It was logged as received and assigned a case number. Then marked for review. Then the review was deferred to a committee that doesn't meet for another 4 months. Standard procedure. The committee that reviews inmate petitions meets quarterly. Your document was received between meetings. It won't even be looked at until November. Which is why we're doing this in July." Whitfield shook his head slowly. "What happens if they just wait you out?" "Then we go further." "How much further can you go?" Santiago didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. On day 14, the CDCR issued a public statement. The department would form a working group to examine SHU conditions. The working group would report within 12 months. The statement did not address any specific demands. Did not commit to any specific changes. Did not acknowledge that inmates had submitted formal requests 6 weeks before the strike began. Draper read the statement in his cell, then asked for the medical form he'd fill out if he chose to continue the strike beyond the point of medical risk. He signed it without hesitation. That same afternoon, Strickland submitted her findings to the California legislature. The prison law office filed a class action lawsuit. The lawsuit alleged that the SHU conditions violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, and included one piece of evidence nobody had noticed until then. In 2009, the California Department of Corrections had quietly revised its gang validation criteria. The revision made it easier to validate inmates, not harder. 3 months after their own internal research showed the system wasn't working, they made it worse. The legislature asked for an explanation. Nobody at the department had one. The hunger strike ended on day 21. Not because the inmates got what they wanted, because their lawyers negotiated a promise. The California Department of Corrections agreed to meet with inmate representatives within 60 days, to review long-term SHU placements, to consider the demands in the agreement to end hostilities, not to implement them, just to consider them. After 21 days of refusing food across 6,600 inmates, the concession was a meeting. Draper resumed eating. Santiago resumed eating. Every SHU inmate across California resumed eating. And then they waited. The 60-day meeting happened. Warden Torres attended. Senior staff attended. The inmate representatives were brought to a conference room in restraints. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The department listened, took notes, asked questions, then issued a statement saying the concerns had been heard and would be reviewed through proper channels. The proper channels were the same ones that had produced nothing for 20 years. Dr. Strickland read the statement in her San Francisco office, then called the lead attorney on the class action lawsuit. "They're not going to change voluntarily," she said. "I know," the attorney replied. "That's why we have a lawsuit." Ashker versus Governor of California was filed in 2012. Named after Todd Ashker, an inmate who had spent over 20 years in the Pelican Bay SHU. The lawsuit argued that long-term solitary confinement in California's SHU system constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. It wasn't the first lawsuit challenging SHU conditions, but it was the most comprehensive. It had the best evidence, and it had Strickland's research. The 2003 internal document showing the department knew its own system wasn't working. The post-2009 validation criteria revision making placement easier despite negative evidence. The individual files showing decades of isolation based on thin, often anonymous evidence. The recidivism data showing worse outcomes for SHU-released inmates. For 3 years, the lawsuit moved through federal courts. During that time, the hunger strikes continued, each one larger. The 2013 strike involved 30,000 inmates, the largest prison hunger strike in American history. Strickland watched from the outside. She provided expert testimony, submitted research reports, documented individual cases. She interviewed over 200 SHU inmates. Their stories shared common threads. Placement based on thin evidence. Inability to challenge validation. No path to release except informing. Years stretching into decades. One inmate had been in the SHU for 26 years. He'd entered at 28. He was 54. He'd never owned a smartphone. Never used the internet. Never seen his grandchildren. He could cite case law more accurately than most attorneys. And he'd spent more than half his life in 80 square feet. "What would you do if you got out?" Strickland asked him. "Teach," he said without hesitation. "Everything I know about the law. Everything I've learned about surviving systems designed to break you. Do you think you'll get out? The lawsuit will change things. Maybe not for me, but for the ones coming after." The settlement came in September 2015, 4 years after the first hunger strike. The California Department of Corrections agreed to fundamental reforms. Indeterminate SHU sentences based solely on gang affiliation would end. Inmates could only be placed in SHU for specific rule violations. Maximum SHU term, 2 years. All long-term SHU cases would be reviewed. Transition programming would be established for inmates leaving isolation. It was a significant victory. The most substantial reform of California's solitary confinement system in its history. Strickland read the settlement terms in her office. She sat quietly for a long time, then thought about something that troubled her. The department had agreed to these terms. But the conditions they were agreeing to end had been documented as harmful since 2003. They'd known for 12 years. And changed nothing until forced. The reviews began in 2016. One by one, long-term SHU inmates were assessed under the new criteria. Robert Draper was reviewed in March. His case file, original validation evidence from 1993. 23 years of perfect conduct. Repeated denial. Under the new criteria, he didn't meet the threshold for continued SHU placement. He was transferred to a general population facility in April 2016. He walked out of the SHU after 23 years. The transition was brutal. Not physically. Logistically and psychologically. He'd spent 23 years in silence. General population was loud. Unpredictable. Full of people. He had a cellmate for the first time in 2 decades. The sound of other people moving, talking, existing was overwhelming. He had trouble sleeping with any light in the room. He had trouble sleeping without knowing exactly where the walls were. The prison psychologist documented his adjustment. He demonstrates classic symptoms of long-term isolation syndrome, anxiety in open spaces, difficulty with social interaction, hypervigilance, sleep disruption. Will he recover? A reporter later asked Strickland. Partially, she said, but 23 years of psychological damage doesn't reverse. The research is clear. Extended isolation changes brain function. Some of those changes are permanent. Santiago was released from SHU in June 2016. 32 years. He'd entered at 22 and left at 54. Like Draper, the transition was difficult. But Santiago had something Draper didn't. Purpose. He immediately connected with civil rights attorneys. Began working as a paralegal for an organization supporting prison reform. His knowledge of the law, acquired through decades of self-study in an 80-square-foot cell, was genuinely useful. He's better prepared than most people I hire, the attorney leading the organization told Strickland. 30 years of reading law books, she replied. Do you think he's okay? Strickland thought about it honestly. No. But he's functioning. Which, given what he endured, is remarkable. Officer James Whitfield had left Pelican Bay in 2012. He'd been quietly reassigned after his call to the journalist became known. Not fired, but sidelined. Administrative duties. No advancement. He left corrections entirely at 43. Worked as a social worker after retraining. Strickland interviewed him in 2016 when writing her comprehensive report on the SHU reforms. Do you regret calling the journalist? She asked. No. The story needed to be out there. It cost you your career. My career in corrections. Not my career. Do you think the reforms go far enough? Whitfield was quiet for a moment. They go further than nothing. Which is what we had before. But the culture doesn't change overnight. The people who ran the SHU system for 30 years still work in corrections. Their thinking doesn't disappear because a settlement requires new policies. So you're skeptical. I'm realistic. When I worked there, the SHU felt normal. It felt like what maximum security was supposed to look like. It took me a long time to understand that normal doesn't mean right. What changed your thinking? Whitfield paused. Santiago. That conversation on day 1 of the strike. He asked me if I'd seen anyone leave the SHU better than they came in. And you hadn't. In 9 years, I couldn't think of a single case. And I realized, if the system produces no good outcomes, what is the system for? Strickland published her comprehensive report in 2017. It documented the full history of California's SHU system. The implementation in 1990, the validation criteria and their application, the 2003 internal research showing the system's failures, the 2009 expansion despite negative evidence, the 2011 hunger strikes, the Ashker lawsuit, the 2015 settlement, and the outcomes so far. The report included a figure that became widely cited. At the time of the Ashker settlement, California held approximately 4,400 inmates in SHU. Of those, approximately 650 had been there for more than 10 years. 145 for more than 20 years. These are not people who committed recent violations, Strickland wrote. These are people who were placed in isolation years or decades ago and never left. The system that was supposed to manage them instead forgot about them. Or worse, remembered them and chose to leave them anyway. Robert Draper was released from California's prison system entirely in 2019. He'd served his full sentence. The original crime plus decades of institutional time. He was 59 years old. He had no family waiting for him. His parents had died during his incarceration. His siblings had moved away. He was given a bus ticket, $200, and the address of a parole officer. He found a room in a boarding house in Sacramento. Got a library card the first week. Began writing. Not a memoir. A legal brief. Documenting his own case as precedent for others still in California's isolation units. Because despite the reforms, despite the settlement, isolation in California hadn't ended. It had been reformed. Restricted. Made harder to apply. But not eliminated. And the criteria, while tighter, still relied on evidence that could be anonymous. Still allowed placement without meaningful hearings. Still created situations where the only way out was cooperation that endangered others. Draper knew this because he'd read the settlement terms carefully. Understood exactly what had and hadn't changed. And knew that somewhere in California, right now, there were people sitting in 80-square-foot cells. Based on evidence they'd never seen. With no clear path to release. Just like he'd been. Strickland testified before the California State Senate in 2020. She was asked to assess the progress of SHU reforms 5 years after the settlement. Her assessment was carefully documented. SHU population had decreased significantly, from approximately 4,400 to under 500. Long-term placements had been dramatically reduced. Transition programming had been implemented. These were real improvements. But she identified persistent problems. The replacement system, security threat group management, used similar validation concepts in new language. The reliance on anonymous informants had not been fully eliminated. Inmates still reported being unable to meaningfully challenge the evidence against them. Have we solved solitary confinement in California? She concluded. No. We've reduced its worst excesses. We've established that indefinite isolation based on status rather than behavior is legally indefensible. But the underlying tension remains. Institutions designed for control will always find mechanisms for isolation. The names change. The policies change. The forms change. But the impulse persists. A senator asked her, what would it take to truly solve this? Strickland thought for a moment. Transparency. Independent oversight. Regular external review of every person in isolation. Make it impossible to forget people. Is that achievable? Everything I've described has been implemented somewhere else in the world. Germany. The Netherlands. These aren't utopias. They're countries that made different decisions about what corrections is for. And what is corrections for? That's the question California has been avoiding for 30 years. Santiago was invited to address a conference on prison reform in Los Angeles in 2021. He walked to the podium slowly. 57 years old. 32 years in isolation. He looked out at the audience of lawyers, researchers, advocates, and officials. I spent 32 years in a cell, he said. 32 years. I went in young and came out old. I missed my mother's death. My father's death. My nephew's entire childhood. The room was silent. I'm not asking for sympathy. I made choices that brought me there. But the punishment I received wasn't proportional to those choices. It wasn't proportional to anything. It was just what the system did. Automatically. Without thought. Without review. Without anyone asking whether it made sense. He paused. When we started the hunger strikes, people said we were manipulating the system. That we were dangerous gang leaders trying to expand our power. Some of us were. Some of us were just people who'd been forgotten in concrete rooms and needed someone to notice. He looked down at his notes. The agreement to end hostilities that we submitted in 2011. That document that the warden filed and scheduled for review in November. The document that Officer Whitfield read and called a journalist about. That document was real. The cooperation between rivals that produced it was real. We weren't performing. We were trying to tell someone that people were suffering. He looked up. Did it work? Partially. The reforms are real. The lawsuit changed things. The hunger strikes created pressure that produced change. But Robert Draper spent 23 years before they reviewed his case. The man I mentioned. He was 59 when he got out. 59. With $200 and a bus ticket. He let that settle. Whatever you think about the people in those cells, whatever they did, whatever they represent, ask yourself, is that what correction looks like? Is that what justice looks like? A 59-year-old man with a library card and a legal brief, rebuilding a life with the tools he taught himself in a box. The reforms continued past 2015 into the 2020s. SHU populations fell further. Oversight increased. Programming expanded. But isolation in California's prisons never fully ended. By 2023, advocates were documenting new forms of restrictive housing that functioned similarly to the old SHU. Different name. Revised criteria. Same essential experience. Strickland published a follow-up paper. Its title, The Institutional Persistence of Isolation. Its conclusion, systems do not voluntarily abandon mechanisms of control. They rename them. They revise their criteria. They make incremental adjustments when forced by legal or political pressure. But the fundamental impulse to isolate, to disappear, to place people in boxes and forget about them, that impulse requires constant, vigilant resistance. This could happen again, because it never fully stopped. In California, in other states, in federal facilities, people are sitting in isolation units right now. Some are there for legitimate behavioral reasons. Some are there because the classification system said so. Some are there because they wouldn't become informants. And some are there because the system has simply forgotten to review their cases. The agreement to end hostilities that 5 rival gang leaders signed in 2011 said something remarkable. We will stop fighting each other. Because the real problem is what's being done to all of us. It took 4 years of lawsuits and hunger strikes and 30,000 people refusing food to get California to take that seriously. And even now, the work isn't finished. Officer Whitfield left corrections and became a social worker because he couldn't answer Santiago's question. Have you seen anyone leave the SHU better than they came in? The honest answer, even after reforms, is rarely. And the question that follows is the one California still hasn't fully answered. If the system doesn't make people better, if it doesn't make communities safer, if it produces documented psychological harm and worse outcomes upon release, what exactly is it for? If this story shook you, the next one will be worse. Because the question isn't whether isolation damages people. The research is clear. The question is why we keep doing it anyway.